Do you believe that there is a model minority living in the US? Who are they? We'll discuss the model minority coming up next on Talking with Henrietta. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to my show. For several decades, many of us have heard the term model minority to talk about Asian Americans in the US. But how did this term come to be? And are Asian Americans really the model minority? I have 4 Stanford University professors with me today to discuss this subject. They're doctors Ronald Hu, Robert Wong, Brian Lin, and Ronak Trivedi. And I'll go back and introduce each of them separately. Dr. Ronald Hu is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Stanford University, and she works as the medical director of the acute psychiatric inpatient unit at Stanford Hospital, where she specializes in the care of those with serious mental illnesses, including schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression. Dr. Robert Wong is an instructor of medicine at Stanford University, where he is a gastroenterologist who seeks to use both science and his clinical practice to improve the prevention, diagnosis, and therapy of digestive malignancies. Dr. Brian Lin is a clinical professor of medicine at Stanford University, where he is primarily a care physician, a primary care physician, educator, and researcher. He is the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Asian Health Research and Education. And my last guest, Dr. Ronak Trivedi, is a clinical health psychologist, an assistant professor with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and director of caregiving and family systems at the Stanford Center for Asian Health Research and Education. She is interested in improving the health of South Asians with serious illness, and she envisions building healthcare systems that provides culturally attuned care to both patients and their family caregivers. Now, we'll be going back over each of your introductions as you talk to talk about how you perceive the model minority description. So let's begin. Where did it come from? And just how do you see it applying? How did it happen to be applied to Asian Americans? So any of you who'd like to begin?
So my understanding, we're a bunch of physicians and not historians, so take this with a grain of salt. My understanding is that the term arose in I think sometime in the 60s, around the time when, the post-war era, that, the Asian American community was perceived as having some great economic and educational success. I think it was specifically from the New York Times, referring to the Japanese American community. And then that was before my time. And then in the 80s, I distinctly remember this. There was a cover photo of Asian American whiz kids. I think it was in the late 80s in Time magazine. So this, and we refer to it not just model minority, but model minority myth. And there's a reason we use the word myth associated with it, but I'll leave it to my colleagues to discuss their views on that.
Any of you would like to add to that, the origins of the term?
Dr. Lin has, go ahead.
Go ahead, Rona.
Dr. Lin has a better memory than I do, but yeah, we can talk a little bit more about the repercussions of it, that it serves to other people and divide people from each other. It provokes envy. It causes people's needs to be unrecognized and unmet. But I think Dr. Trivedi wanted to talk a little bit more about the history as well.
No, I think Dr. Hu, I think hit the nail on the head that what is a challenge of this. And I just wanted to point out that it's a stereotype. And I think labeling it as such is really important, because as with all stereotypes, we can perpetuate false notions of a group of people that represents basically 2/3 of the world, right? And it also causes divisions, not only within the Asian community, but also with other minorities, because it perpetuates this idea that other racial and ethnic minorities could also achieve the same level of success that's kind of wrapped up in this model minority myth if they just put their heads down and work hard like the Asian people do. So as you can see, there's a lot of layers of problems to the sentences I just stated. And I think I'm assuming going to be talking more about the challenges of being parts of this community, as well as the implications of being labeled as such.
So on a personal level, have any of you run into that in your education or as a professional? Has it affected you on a personal level?
I mean, absolutely. I I can tell many stories, but I think in a way it can be biased favorably. You know, you can be in a class as a student, and then the assumption is, oh, that that student is Asian. Maybe they're better at math is one of the stereotypes. Better at science. There's also negative, of course, stereotypes. Maybe the Asians are not as good at expressing themselves. Their personality is a little bit more blank, or stereotypically participate in certain activities. With the recent Supreme Court case litigating affirmative action that was brought up with Harvard. Harvard admissions had consistently ranked Asian applicants as having less of a dynamic, or I forget what the ranking scale was there. But I still distinctly remember, I grew up in Tennessee, went to school in Boston, came out to California, so I've been around the country, and it's very interesting. I was at a Big Lots, and I was in like the kind of telephone equipment aisle. This is back when fewer people had, actually nobody had smartphones. People had landlines, and I was there with my brother, clearly standing out in Tennessee, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and this older couple came to me and says, "Oh, I have a question for you. Do you mind helping us?" And I said, I don't work here. I'm not, and she's like, "Oh, I know you don't work here, but you people know about these things." And they had said they thought that I, had some greater technical ability about their telephone problem. I hate to say I fulfilled the stereotype because I knew the answer to their question, but I also studied engineering, so I had a background to that. So they
So you see, all you did was further the stereotype in their mind. Right?
I had a further. I paused in my mind, and I said, "Should I answer their question?" I actually considered strongly, like, maybe I shouldn't answer the question so as not to further the stereotype. But, I grew up in the 80s, so that was the kind of whole time when there was kind of similar, analogous to now, where there's kind of fear of China, there was fear of Japan in terms of, is America behind Japan? So, that came out a lot. People thought I was Japanese and said, "Oh, you must be good at things that we hear the Japanese are good at." But I don't know. I want to hear from Robert, because Robert's a little bit younger than us and maybe grew up in a different environment. I don't know, Robert. What is your experience?
Yeah, so I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s in Ohio. Actually, my background here is a farm that's just next door to us, where they raised horses. And so my county, Medina County, Ohio, in the 1990s was 97% non-Hispanic white. So that means all minorities combined, Hispanics, Blacks, American Indians, and Asians, collectively constituted about 3% of the population. So it was a very homogenous society, and a lot of people in that part of the country didn't really know any Chinese Americans. My parents are from Taiwan. So, growing up, I didn't experience a lot of racism per se, just because I feel like it requires a critical threshold or mass of a certain group to really kind of to have to create enough fear to cause racism. So I don't think there was any racism, and certainly I think there was a perception that Asians, people who looked like me, were better at math, that were better at science, that cared a lot about schooling, that Asians, their parents pushed them really hard to do well in school.
And you mean to say none of that is true?
I think for any myth, there is always a kernel of truth to the myth. So if you look at the data, Asians, on average, do have a higher household income. Those households that self-identify as Asian do have a higher median and mean income than the general American population, than even among non-Hispanic whites. Asians, on average, if you look at the entirety of the Asian American population, is better educated. There's a higher percentage of Asian adults with tertiary degrees, with graduate degrees, compared to the average population and compared to non-Hispanic whites. So there is some element to truth in that, if you measure success in terms of social and economic achievements or characteristics, Asians as a aggregate, you could see why some people might think that. But I think, to Dr. Trivedi's point, generalizations are also incredibly dangerous, and they can cause great harm. And I think where this can, in particular for Asians, can cause great harm is that Asians are not one entity. We don't look alike. We don't come from the same background. We don't speak the same languages. We don't eat the same foods at home. And so when you disaggregate Asians out into smaller groups like Japanese Americans, the Japanese American population, for instance, there have been Japanese Americans for over 100 years because they came, far earlier than other groups.
Now, I should say to you, when I asked that question, I wasn't completely serious.
But you asked it. It's an important point to make, that yes, there is some truth to the fact that on aggregate, Asians do have higher social and economic and educational attainment compared to the average American household. I think we just have to acknowledge that early on, that there is some truth to this, but there's also danger to generalizing too broadly.
Yes, and at the same time, what that overlooks is the percentage of Asian Americans who also fall among the poorest in the country.
And I think that's precisely the purpose of tonight's talk, is that concept that by generalizing too broadly, we are at risk of ignoring very substantial economic disparities and health disparities for certain portions of the Asian American community.
That's
So,
Dr. Who.
So I have some historical examples of what you're saying, not historical like from history, but from my own history and with patients. So I'd like to go back to that point, but very, very recently, there were the Lunar New Year shootings, both in Monterey Park, Los Angeles, but also in Half Moon Bay, very near us, just on the other side of the hill from Stanford. And I went out there immediately afterwards and found some of the most miserable living conditions among Chinese, non-English speaking farm workers who had been there for years, and most people didn't know they were there. And because no one really knew what to do about them, there's been, I think, an underappreciation of their needs. And then so they're quickly othered from the rest of the sort of model minority thing, and then they get shamed and blamed. It's like, in the same way the model minority myth can be weaponized, can damage other people who it's sort of like, why aren't you like them? These farm workers, it's sort of like, why didn't you, I don't know, study harder? Why don't you go back to China? And not appreciating that these are people who have been working their absolute hardest, supporting multiple generations of family members, and it makes them less than. So that's a recent example. And then, you were asking about things in our own life. I remember when I was doing an obstetrics rotation in medical school, and the white male resident told me, the medical student, that Asian women felt less pain. And this was with a little bit of admiration, but it was, it completely surprised me. And so then the next woman who went into labor went, and he said, "What's this tongue clicking thing that they do?" And I said, "That's pain." And I think I spent a long time being angry about, as a medical student, I couldn't say much, but I thought about all of the women who had, third degree tears and, didn't get sufficient pain medication, partly because of this sort of myth of them being more stoic and so forth. But then later I also thought about internal reasons for this. So this was someone who maybe didn't know how other groups expressed pain, and then just assumed that this was like a good thing. But then when I gave birth to a 9.5-pound baby, many years later, my own mother said, above all, don't cry out. So in Chinese, 千万不要, 10,000 times don't cry out, 10,000 times don't wiggle around. And I realized that the model minority myth can seem protective, can seem positive for someone who is seemingly on the right end of it, but it's very much a two-edged sword.
Let me just comment on that, because it's the first time I've heard that. African Americans are not considered by any means the model minority, but it's surprising to me to hear that Asians aren't supposed to feel pain as much, because that's a stereotype about African Americans. So
Yeah.
I wonder what other racial group is supposed to feel pain less than other people.
And it makes us less human, right? Right.
Or less needy when it comes to having medications.
Less needy, but also, it's definitely a two-edged sword.
Yes, Dr. Trivedi, any personal experiences on your part because of the model minority myth?
Yeah, I was reflecting on this. So I actually grew up in India, where, as you might imagine, I was surrounded by other Indian people, more so than anybody else. And I moved to the US as an adult. And I was reflecting on where I might have experienced this in my professional life. And I remembered when I was a couple of examples. When I was doing my graduate work at Duke, the chair of psychiatry was Dr. Rangakrishnan, an Indian man, and he was very beloved by his patients, and he had a very good reputation. And I remember I was just going to my office, and this woman a patient got onto the elevator with me, and she said, "Are you Indian?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you related to Dr. Ranga?" And I said, "No," because there's a lot of us, and we're not all related. But then she took my hand and she said, you all are so nice." And it was this moment of suddenly I was being grouped in. So again, it's a double-edged sword. Like, she was, in her mind, she was giving me a compliment, right? She was saying, the very fact that you have brown skin, like this doctor I really like, means that you must be nice. And I was like, who is all you all, right? And I was like, you haven't met a lot of people I've met, obviously, right? Many people I'm related to, I can guarantee you, would not fall in the bucket. But I think that it's sort of this, it perpetuates in these ways in a professional context that is, I'm not even there as their provider. I was just in the elevator, happened to be going to the same floor. And the other place was, Dr. Wong mentioned that he grew up in Ohio, and I did some of my training in Wisconsin, which is Dane County, Madison. Dane County is 95% non-Hispanic white.
Me too, by the way.
Oh,
Yeah,
I have a
Madison,
theory.
Wisconsin.
Everybody's 6 degrees away from Wisconsin. This is a true story. And there was this, one of the physicians one of the units we worked on, one of the physicians was from India, very dark skin. And a lot of people kind of associate, they, compared to the other doctor who was white, they kind of they said he was nicer, he was kinder, he was softer, all these things, but they also referred to him as that boy. And it was hard to sort of witness this, to have your patients refer to a physician in that way that was clearly harking back to some really problematic language, because they just thought, oh, he's dark skin, and that's why, so that, get me that boy. That, it's like, you mean the doctor? It's like, yes, the boy. So
when you said, do you mean the doctor? Did the person
yes.
come back with you still with the boy?
Yeah, so they were referring to the doctor, the physician.
Yes, I understand, as the boy.
Yeah. Yes.
And when you corrected them, when you said, you mean the doctor, did they come back and say, yes, the boy?
Yeah. So they to them, that was an okay way to sort of refer to the person who was on, the attending on the unit, basically. So I think I think both of those are not an example of model minority in that same way, but I think each of us are illustrating how each story we can come up with that says, oh, we were putting in this nice bucket. Also, we have stories of how that either we witnessed somebody being harmed as a result of this myth, or we ourselves were harmed as a result of this myth.
So, since you all work at hospitals at various levels, how does this myth affect your patients? Or do you see it affecting your patients?
I've started a clinic at Stanford specifically for Asian patients, and it comes up all the time. The flip side of Dr. Trivedi's experience of, oh, you're so nice, is that you don't ever get to be not nice. You don't ever get to be angry. You don't ever get to be sad. And so, I've been told that, y'all are so quiet and shy, and starting with the sentence, you people, of course, you people are all, it's rarely a sentence
I have to laugh because I've been subjected to that too. You people, it's always the other, right? We're always classified as the other, you people.
And you never really like the end of that sentence when it starts with you people, right? It's usually, even if it's meant as a compliment, there's an edge to it. There's a you have to conform to this. And in my patients, so not all of my patients are in the Asian research clinic. It's actually called SMART Clinic, Stanford Mental Health for Asians Research and Treatment. And it's a play on the model minority. My daughter says that it should be called SMAFART Clinic because it's Stanford Mental Health for Asians Research and Treatment. So you can call it that if you like.
I'm thinking calling it SMART, doesn't that kind of reinforce the idea that
is something that we're kind of being ironic about? And And it's good for people to bring up that discussion. We put that there because we wanted it to sort of decrease stigma, so that if it's in their phone or whatever, that it's hard for a lot of Asians to talk about mental health. And so we wanted people to be able to come to the clinic and not be hampered by judgy relatives or friends and neighbors. Um, but a lot of the research on Asians and mental health is that young Asians are at a higher risk of suicide than their non-Asian peers. Perfectionism is a very high risk factor for depression, and you know the model minority myth of you have to get into a good college or you're not normal, or what's wrong with you. You have to be perfect. You can't have any needs. That's very damaging.
Now, I'm just wondering, we heard several years ago from the Tiger Mom or about Tiger Moms. So I am wondering, this pressure, how much is it coming from the family itself? Having nothing to do with the model minority myth, or is that pressure also part of it related to the outside minority myth?
I think it all feeds into each other, right? We're not isolated units, right? We're part of society. We live in communities, right? There's pressure externally, internally, but is the internal pressure caused in part of the model minority myth to live up, quote unquote, live up to that myth? I think it's very powerful and powerfully, damaging to have these unrealistic expectations. It's kind of interesting. There was a comedy group that Doctor Who, I think you saw a little bit of at a panel she was on recently, and jokingly, they're an Asian American comedy group, and their goal is to use comedy to improve mental health among Asian, well, actually all youth, but they have a particular interest in Asian youth, being Asian, and they joked around that because I studied engineering and medicine, that I'm kind of a double threat, right? Asian parents' dream, and that's very damaging. It's unrealistic. I mean, it just happened to be coincidental because those were things I'm interested in. But it can be damaging if the child is not interested in medicine, not interested in engineering or any of the other kind of areas. I think the other area I wanted to bring up that's potentially limiting is the negative side of the model myth, that model minority myth, which my colleagues have brought up. But even in academics, we are viewed as okay, the great workers can get the science, can get the clinical work done, but when it comes to leadership, there is a glass ceiling. I just found some numbers. Asians make up 8.4% of faculty members in higher education. So, a bit beyond the 6% of the Asian American community in the US, but only 1% of college presidents. So, and then if you look even at Stanford, we do have some Asian American leaders in the medical school, but not reflective of the, I think, 30+% Asian American faculty at Stanford in the medical school. So that's where you could, again, the double-edged sword of, well, very good at studying, very good at things done, but maybe not a leader, right? There's a negative aspect of that.
Yes, not only in academia, but also in the corporate world as a whole. I came across similar statistics talking about the very low percentage of Asian Americans who are CEOs or have leadership positions in corporations. So it seems it's very, it affects Asian Americans across the board. Now, Dr. Wong, I'm wondering, when it comes to gastroenterology, and I hope I'm saying that correctly.
You said it perfectly, Henrietta.
I'm thinking the patients who come to you,
Yeah.
would their medical problems in any way stem from some of the pressures that they might find themselves under, related to their ethnic identities?
So to clarify, you're asking, do the patients who present with gastrointestinal problems have a cause present because of their identity crisis?
Yes,
I'm sorry, can
maybe
you just
because of
reflect?
the stress that they might be experiencing.
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, there is an association or a linkage between chronic stress and all types of digestive diseases, including irritable bowel syndrome, which is a very common condition which affects maybe 10 or 20% of Americans, as well as other functional types syndromes that we call them, so chronic abdominal pain. And so there is an association between stress and also, unfortunately, a history of abuse and gastrointestinal symptoms. Now, how much of that is related to race? That I'm not sure. You know, I do know that there are differences by culture, in culture, of how people can express pain, and I think that's been a theme that's been talked about tonight. You know, do different people feel pain differently? I don't think so. I don't think there's any biological data to support that. There might be, however, some differences in the ways you may be expected culturally to express pain, specifically with regards to psychological pain. So, you know, there is some thought that that in certain cultures, it's not acceptable to have depression. Well, there may not even be a term for depression, and so, you know, one way then to express your, you know, your sense of suffering may be through a complaint, like a somatic complaint, such as, you know, functional pain, abdominal pain. So there might be some cultural component to that. Uh, there's also, you know, in terms of kind of my practice actually, unfortunately, it is very focused because I do a lot of procedures. We do a lot of procedures on patients with advanced cancer toward the end of life. And we have to have these very, very difficult conversations about, do you want to have this procedure, which may extend your life this amount of time, but there's also a 10% risk that this procedure might lead to, you might die from this procedure in a worst case situation. And, you know, one thing that I've found is that actually in a lot of Asian families, there are major communication problems at the end of life. And so this idea of, like, in our Western concept of palliative care, of, you know, emphasizing, say, the quality of life over the length of life, that term is actually very foreign in Asia. Up until recently, in fact, it was considered disrespectful to even kind of talk about death with your parents. And there was a movie that came out a couple of years ago with Awkwafina called The Farewell. I don't know if anyone on this in this meeting saw it, but it was basically about Chinese American woman, a young woman whose grandmother was dying from lung cancer in China, except she didn't know it because her family was too terrified to tell. They thought it would cause her anxiety and fear that she was going to die, so they just didn't tell her that she had lung cancer. And you know what? That's actually very true. I've seen many cases where the family will just not tell their father, their mother, that they have a terminal illness. And it becomes, and I'm confronted with this because it's awfully difficult to consent a patient for a potentially life-threatening procedure when they don't even know their diagnosis. So that's, as a gastroenterologist, I do see that a lot, and I think that is an aspect of the medical care that we definitely need to research more. This communication research focused on culturally sensitive, culturally specific communication at the end of life.
So do you think, before you respond, Dr. Trivedi? Do you think the patient in that circumstance might know it anyway, but might not want to share it with the rest of the family? Dr. Wong?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're asking me or Dr. Trivedi?
No, I was asking you. I was asking Dr. Trivedi to hold her point while I asked you, do you think the patient who might be dying knows it anyway, but does not want to share it with the family for fear the family might be upset?
Yeah, that I don't know. That is a very interesting question. That maybe that secretly the patient really knows that something is really wrong, but they don't want to upset. They don't want to cause grief or harm to their family. Um, I don't know. I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that this type of problem is just not appreciated, not being talked about. Though I guess this movie, The Farewell, that things like that are hopefully will make a difference. And I think that there needs to be more attention and more money and funding for research that focuses on this type of these gaps in communication and the importance of culturally sensitive and culturally specific communication.
Sure, Dr. Trivedi, you might have wanted to respond to that, but I'm just wondering if you find communication issues such as that one as you're dealing with some of your patients.
Yeah, and actually, Dr. Wong, I just want to pick up where Dr. Wong started. So we have a project that is actually looking at breast cancer survivors who are South Asian women and their family caregivers. My expertise is focusing on how patients and families together manage chronic and serious health conditions. And so we talked with survivors, we talked with their family members, and we also talked with some providers to talk about culturally attuned care. And this is very much a real phenomena where people are hiding diagnosis of cancer specifically to our population because it's a heavily stigmatized condition. There's a lot of myths around cancer in the South Asian community. So they're hiding it, but they're also, as Dr. Wong said, hiding it from their family. So family members may not know that somebody who is a parent is diagnosed. And there's, of course, the end of life piece of it, but people might be entering treatment for what is a chronic condition of cancer, but they're often also not told what the diagnosis is. So it gets really complicated really fast. So we are learning more about the communication styles and what people want to learn. But
now I have a question for you, and forgive
yes.
me for interrupting.
No, please.
It seems to me if you call any hospital or want to speak to any doctor, the first question is, are you calling for yourself? And if you're calling for somebody else, well, I'm sorry, I can't give you that information because it's private information related to the patient. So wouldn't the patient be the first one to know whether they had cancer or not? No. Why would their family members be the ones to know?
If you've attended visits with a loved one, you know, sometimes that is, you're basically implying this person can be present for this conversation. There's HIPAA waivers, and of course, there's language barriers. So a lot of times people are bringing a family member because they don't speak the language, or they're not as fluent to understand medicalese. And so there's a lot of filtering that can occur in that step alone for the language. And sometimes the patients themselves might say, I don't want to hear it. You tell them. I don't want to know if it's anything bad. I just need to focus on staying positive. And that's something you hear a lot too in this serious illness population, that I don't want to know the details. You tell them. Don't give me the diagnosis. Don't give me the label. They will handle it. So they are giving permission a lot of times tacitly or sometimes explicitly to have that kind of dynamic take place. And, I think it gets really complicated for healthcare providers actually in the situation. We just finished some analysis of our provider data, and we actually find that providers actually feel really torn about this when they do not find that they can provide their evidence-based medicine because the families are pushing back against providing good pain management or making sure that people are being aware of their choices and their options. So that's, I think that to Dr. Wong's point, I just wanted to unpack it a little bit for some of the work we've been doing. I also want to pick up something that Dr. Hu mentioned in terms of some of the statistics of the mental health issues in the world that I live in, with the looking at unpaid caregivers. So there's a family and friends who are helping a loved one or a partner or somebody taking care of some health conditions. Compared to other groups, Asian Americans are most likely to report feeling trapped in that role, feeling that they don't have a choice to play that role because they have to live up to that expectations of taking care of their family member, and they can share within the community if they're feeling stressed and burdened. So that adds to the compounds the mental health challenges that they already experience. Add on top of that, that they're less likely to seek mental health care, as Dr. Hu's work and her clinic sort of are testament to. Then you have this double problem, is that you can't talk to anybody, so you continue to kind of have to hold it inside. So it's the model minority is kind of an outside looking in stereotype, but there's also a lot of layers to how a lot of these stoicism and other sort of resilience is internalized within the community as well.
So what's the solution? And I know it's not a simple answer. I would think it's not a simple answer. But what do you think can be done in terms of dispelling the model minority myth from the public at large, and also lessening its effect on individual members and families?
I think there's a lot of things that can be done because it's multifactorial. You notice that when you said tiger mother, I didn't get up from my chair. I was able to reach right from next to my computer, my copy, which you can see is extensively highlighted and practically memorized, because it did talk. I'm not saying that we should follow it because it's not a how-to book, but it was very honest about a lot of the pressure that comes from within families to live up to this myth. So one of the things is to help the families themselves understand that the model minority myth is damaging and that they shouldn't be trying to live up to it, because it makes people seem invulnerable when they really are vulnerable. And as Dr. Trivedi was saying, the statistics are that only 1/4 of the people of Asians that need mental health help will go and get it. So that means 3/4 are not getting it. And then even though about 1/3 of non-Asians going to a clinic might not show up again after the first visit, half of the Asians will not come back afterwards. And they're, if they finally get up the courage to get there, then they feel like, oh, this won't help, or they lose faith in it right away. So just adding on to what Dr. Trivedi was saying. So one thing is within the family. A lot of the Asian families have come from, Dr. Wong was saying, Japanese Americans are often here. It's the only group where the main language spoken at home is English these days. So most Japanese Americans are second, third generation or more. Everybody else came from somewhere, often fled conditions that were difficult. And so a lot of times they've been traumatized by whatever caused them to have to move. And then they become very scared and very rigid in their thinking. And then they try to perpetuate that the only way out is to adhere to the model minority myth. So it does include the family members, but also amongst everyone else, I think not othering one another and not saying, so when I have had family member, or I have had family, friends, whatever, say, oh, well, we're like this or you're like this, and why can't other people like that? And I try to stop them right away and say, that's not helpful. They're
And
to
they say, well, why not? We're complimenting you, and other people should be like you. Or
and then
could
I
be
try to
like
have a conversation if I can about the why not. Um, I'm old enough to remember that when 4 white police officers beat Rodney King, Koreatown got burnt down. And so when we're othered and divided and then, we're made less human, and then they say, oh, but you get to be a little better as long as you aren't one of them, and then, that's very damaging. We're all ultimately in the same boat. We all really do want to have our lives be okay. Dr. Trevedian talking about caregivers and Dr. Huang and talking about end of life decisions. What is the mortality rate of the human race? 100%. I borrowed that from someone. I'll have to pay her a nickel afterwards for borrowing that. But we all feel pain. We all have needs, and we will all ultimately die. And so arguing with each other or setting up these sort of awful, one up, one down, it's not a zero-sum game. We're really all part of the same humanity.
Yes, and I'd like to ask that question of the rest of you, and I'll get back to it, but I have 2 team members in this discussion, and I'd like to give them a chance to see if they might have a question or an observation. So Yuki or Tonga Victoria, any questions?
I will say, from hearing about a lot about what's been discussed, really reminds me a lot of Kathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings, which sort of really addresses the whole bottom minority myth. And in the same conversation of mental health, being Asian in America, we're taught to minimize our feelings and really just sort of internalize them, leading towards like a lot of other mental health issues and mental health stigmas that is rampant within broader Asian America. I thought that was at least this conversation really reminded me of that book.
Tonga Victoria? Tonga
Hi,
Victoria
everyone.
is from Tonga, and Yuki, tell them where you're from.
Oh, I'm from Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands.
Tonga
Hi,
Victoria.
everyone. I'm not from Tonga, born and raised in East Palto, but my parents are of Tongan descent. I currently live there for a majority of the year, doing work there, and then also stateside. And it's such a pleasure to be in this space tonight. This is definitely not the typical space that I'm usually in. Definitely not with MDs and doctors. But nonetheless, I'm so grateful to be in this space, and I wanted to share with you all. One of the things that I've been working on today is looking at our AAPI Heritage Month in review. How well did we do on the national front, in organizations, companies, and individuals really taking that initiative to learn more about our cultures, learn more about our communities. And then from my standpoint, being in community doing this work, there's also that level to that. So building out a poll to kind of gauge where people and how people showed up during this month of May, or was it just a month of May for them? And I think that that'll give us a better sense of where the acronym and then also the communities, both at the alliance front and the actual fight within our respective communities, to see what that'll look like next year. If this is something that is going to be ongoing, I think for the rest of the future of America, there's always going to be that month, that AAPI month, and I think more and more our grassroots orgs are seeing both the opportunity and then also the constant conflict of being in community with groups, ethnicities, cultures that are so vastly different, which I think is beautiful. The richness and the wealth of each of our respective cultures, and what does that look like on the census? What does that look like in community? So yeah, I wanted to share that, and really looking forward to hopefully staying connected with y'all.
Any comments on her comment?
No, I think both of your comments, Yuki and Tonga, are really, I guess it relates to your question, Henrietta, about how do we kind of address this myth. Is that it's really the generational change, right? Perceptions change with very slowly. I think speaking to what Doctor Who was saying, I think each generation, I hope, we are getting better at seeing each other as people, as Doctor Who said, and not as groups or stereotypes. And I see that among the Stanford students. I mean, one of the wonderful things about being at Stanford is we have patients and postdocs and graduate students, but also we have undergraduates and even high school students who come to campus. And I can see that myself, having grown up, in the 70s and 80s, and things have really changed. Students are very respectful of each other, where they're from, their identities. I also wanted to make a point is, I think one thing that can contribute to addressing this myth is really portrayals and representation. In Hollywood and other places in leadership, to really show that there's just a huge diversity of experience among all communities of color. Myself, one of my friends I happened to meet is Wayne Wong, who directed the Joy Luck Club, and that was the only movie for 20 years, a major Hollywood movie that portrayed Asian Americans in kind of a human light, not as a kung fu master or not as a, engineer, hacker, or something like that. And now, look at all the great portrayals we have, leading up to even Asian American-born Chinese and on Disney. No advertisement; they didn't pay me. But I think the next generation, you guys make me very hopeful. But also, I think the portrayals are very important, and progress is being made on that front.
I just got a question in the chat that Ron DeSantis banned Black history in Florida schools, but is mandating that Asian history be taught in school. So what do you think of that? Is that a way of pitting people against each other, or?
That's pitting people against each other. And one of the shows that he banned was the biography of Bill Russell, which, he's this amazing Black basketball player who was also a civil rights leader, but apparently that was too scary or something. But it's an inspiring story, and then, that becomes banned. Bryant, they didn't pay me for the Bill Russell documentary either. But representation matters. And I think just one example in terms of Asians is that in Korea, there was a lot of stigma against either having a mental illness or being a psychiatrist and treating mental illness. And then there was a show called It's Okay, It's Love. And overnight, the rates of people applying for psychiatry residencies went up because it was acceptable to have a mental health issue. It was acceptable to talk about it. The people were, believable and human. And previously psychiatrists were portrayed as being kind of nutty. And so nobody wanted to go into it. And you only went into psychiatry if you had failed your other medical school rotations, which, by the way, came up in my family where, there's Asians are underrepresented in mental health, possibly overrepresented in some other areas, but underrepresented in mental health. And when I said I wanted to go into psychiatry, my dad said, do you really believe in Floyd? And I said, it's Freud, Dad, and that's not all of psychiatry. Um, and, my mom said, but you got honors in ophthalmology. I was like, I did. And it's sort of like, so why aren't you going into ophthalmology? Because I don't want to go into. So there was this whole idea of psychiatry, mental health, the patients, the practitioners all being at the bottom of this. And representation is key in being able to talk about these things and making it okay.
Sure. And are there other things that you could think of? Dr. Wong, Dr. Trivedi, that you think might be key also?
Yeah, I mean, I think my colleagues touched on I think the major themes to combat the model minority myth. Because of the stigma, there are fewer Asian psychiatrists. Even outside of medicine, I think we need more Asian representation in the entertainment industry. So it's great that K-pop has taken off. I think that's a wonderful thing. We need more Asian sports heroes like Jeremy Lin, we need more Asians in sports, in entertainment, in music, to show the next generation that any field, any discipline is possible. Asians don't have to be just doctors, scientists, lawyers, engineers, accountants, numbers, calculator. You can be anything that, as long as you're interested and you have passion for it, that we need those role models. And I think that will come with time. And then I think the other important thing is, to Dr. Hu's point, we just have to realize that we're all Americans, and we're all humans, and just really trying to see through race and not generalize. And this is a way to combat not just the model Asian minority myth, but I think just racism in general. Give everybody a chance, get to know them, talk to them, figure out who they are as a person. Don't it's not an equation where, if oh, this is a middle-aged Asian man, therefore most likely he is a doctor. So yeah, just get to know everybody, take the time, and combat your preconceptions. And language can be hurtful. I think that's been mentioned several times tonight too. Language can be hurtful. So this movement over the last several years to really be thoughtful about what you say and how you say it. I think that's a positive development.
Well, I think all of you have given us some very important insights in terms of what the model minority myth is all about and what we need to do to combat it. So I very much appreciate your sharing, and I look forward to talking with you again and would like to thank you so very much for being in this discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Henrietta, for inviting us.
Henrietta.
Yes.